under the shimmering chandeliers of Le Pavin, where crystal glasses caught the golden glow of candlelight, and hushed voices carried the weight of power. Jon Maxwell sat alone. The restaurant, a palace of velvet curtains and marble floors, thrummed with wealth's quiet rhythm. Each table was its own kingdom, executives sealing deals with nods over Bordeaux, couples draped in diamonds whispering secrets across silverware. Yet in the farthest corner, beneath a canopy of orchids, Jon Maxwell seemed untouched by the life around him. He wore his success like armor, an Armani suit that fitted him flawlessly, a platinum watch that reflected every gleam of light, but none of it softened the hollowness carved deep inside him. The chair opposite him remained empty, its silence louder than the piano that floated through the air. That chair had been filled once, long ago, by laughter and warmth, by the delicate presence of Lillian, his wife, and their little boy Caleb. 10 years had passed since the night steel twisted and glass shattered, ripping both from him in an instant. 10 years since he had looked across the table and seen love instead of absence. The plate before him steamed with perfection, filet mignon cooked exactly as he preferred, mashed potatoes sculpted into delicate swirls, vegetables glazed to a shine. The scent drifted upward, rich and inviting, but to Jon it might as well have been dust. He stared at it as if it belonged to another world. His fingers circled the stem of his glass, swirling deep red wine that caught the light like blood. He lifted it halfway to his lips, pausing, weighed down not by glass but by memory. And then it happened. A voice, soft yet sharp enough to cut through the velvet air, drifted into the stillness beside him. "May I have your leftovers, sir?" The sound startled him as though someone had broken a spell. He turned sharply, his gaze falling upon a girl who could not have been more than 19. Her blonde hair was tied into a messy bun, stray strands tumbling like loose threads in the candlelight. Her coat hung thin and frayed over narrow shoulders, the sleeves too short to hide the bruises of winter's chill. In her arms she clutched a baby swaddled in a faded blanket, the child's wide eyes fixed with aching hunger on the untouched food before him. Round them, forks froze in midair, conversations dwindled into silence. Le Pavin was not a place for interruptions, not a place where desperation crossed the polished marble floors. A waiter began to step forward, concern etched across his brow, but Jon lifted a hand slightly, a small gesture, yet it carried the weight of command. The waiter stopped. Jon looked back at her. It was not her torn sneakers or weary posture that caught his breath, it was her eyes. They did not plead. They did not waver. They held him with quiet fierceness, with a sorrow so deep it could not be disguised, and a courage born only of love for the tiny life she carried. She was not asking for herself. She was asking for her child. His throat tightened, a candle between them flickering as if stirred by some unseen wind. For the first time in years, he felt something shift within him, a crack in the wall he had built to keep the world out. He did not speak at once, only studied her, as though the rest of the room had melted away into shadows. Then, almost without realizing, he nudged the plate toward her. His voice was soft, almost a whisper to himself. "Take it." The girl did not dive at the food. She did not tear into it with the desperation of someone starving. Instead, she reached into the satchel slung across her shoulder and pulled out a small square of cloth, clean, though worn at the edges. With care and reverence, she began wrapping the food as though it were treasure. Her hands trembled slightly, not with greed, but with gratitude unspoken. Jon watched her, his heart thudding in a way it had not for years. He could not yet name what had stirred within him, but he knew, with a strange certainty, that something in his world had shifted forever. The murmur of voices returned to Le Pavin like a tide, cautious and uneven. But for Jon Maxwell the world had narrowed to the fragile figure at his table. The girl did not eat. She only bundled the food with painstaking care, folding the cloth as though it were silk, not some scrap she had pulled from her satchel. Every movement revealed her exhaustion, her thin wrists, the way her shoulders shook slightly under the weight of the baby. Yet her eyes never lost that fire, that quiet refusal to bow to pity. Jon found himself staring too long. He should have looked away, should have dismissed her as the others already had in their minds. But he couldn't. The image of her baby's small hand tugging at the frayed edge of the blanket drew him into a memory. He had spent years burying Caleb's fingers, sticky with jam, clinging to his own as they walked across the garden one summer afternoon. His chest tightened, a pressure so sharp he had to swallow hard just to breathe. The girl must have noticed the way he faltered, but she said nothing. Instead, She shifted the baby higher against her chest, rocking gently as though the candle light itself might soothe the child's hunger. Jon glanced at the waiter still frozen a few steps away, then back at the girl. He surprised himself by speaking. "What's your name?" Her gaze flicked up, wary, as though the question carried hidden traps. For a moment he thought she might stay silent, retreat into herself like so many who had asked for scraps only to be shamed. But then she whispered, "Clara." The sound was so soft he almost doubted he'd heard it. It had lingered in his ears, like a note of music. He repeated it under his breath. "Clara." The waiter shifted again, preparing to step forward, but Jon's voice cut through the room with sudden authority. "She's my guest." The words were not loud, but they carried. A ripple spread across the restaurant, a collective intake of breath, and then silence fell once more. The waiter nodded stiffly and retreated, though his eyes darted back with suspicion. Clara lowered her gaze to the bundle of food, but her cheeks flushed. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." Jon's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. "You haven't." He gestured toward the empty chair across from him. "Sit." The invitation hung in the air like a challenge. Clara hesitated, torn between dignity and necessity. Her coat shifted, and Jon saw the baby's face more clearly now. Round cheeks, wide luminous eyes, and a mouth pursed in restless hunger. Something broke inside him. Without waiting for her acceptance, he motioned for another plate. The room buzzed again, whispers rising like wind through grass. No one in Lipovin had ever seen Jon Maxwell extend his solitude to another. Business partners waited months, sometimes years, for a dinner at this table. Now he had offered it to a girl in worn sneakers holding a baby. Suspense thickened with every second. What was she doing here, in a place meant for kings of industry and women? Draped in silk, was she desperate enough to wander in from the street, to cross a threshold meant to keep people like her out? Or was fate playing some cruel trick, weaving her into his night for reasons neither of them yet understood? Clara finally lowered herself into the chair. The candle between them flickered, throwing shadows across her tired face. Jon studied her as though trying to decipher an unreadable code. He noticed the way she held herself straight back despite the weariness, protective arms encircling her child like a shield. She looked at him not with awe at his wealth, but with caution, with the unspoken question of what he would demand in return for his kindness. The second plate arrived. Jon pushed it toward her, and for the first time, her composure cracked. Tears gathered in her eyes. Though she blinked them back fiercely, she fed her baby first, dipping a spoon into the potatoes, guiding it gently to the child's lips. The baby swallowed, let out a small satisfied sound. And in that tiny moment of relief, Jon felt his heart tremble. It was the sound of life, of survival, the sound he had thought he would never hear again. He leaned back, silent, while the restaurant's glow blurred around him. He did not know it yet, but the thread between their worlds had already been knotted. A thread spun from hunger, loss, and something larger neither could name. Somewhere deep inside, where grief had lived untouched for a decade, Jon felt the first tremor of something long buried. Not joy, not hope, but the dangerous possibility of both died, and though he could not explain why, he found himself thinking, this girl and her child were not here by accident. The night outside Lipovin had deepened, rain threading down the glass, walls in silvery streaks, yet inside the restaurant the atmosphere clung to a hushed unease. No one knew quite what to make of Jon Maxwell sharing his table with a girl who had walked in from the shadows of the city. Some eyes were sharp with judgment, others soft with pity, but all kept glancing toward that corner as if something impossible had just cracked the glass shell of their perfect world. Jon himself could not explain the pull that kept him silent, studying her. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she guided another spoonful of potatoes to her baby's lips. The child swallowed, then let out a tiny, almost musical laugh, and for an instant Jon's breath caught. He had not heard that sound in 10 long years, not since Caleb's small body had wriggled against his arms, giggling at the way his father would lift him high toward the ceiling light. The memory struck like lightning. His fingers tightened around the edge of the table, knuckles white, as if holding himself back from shattering completely. Clara noticed. She set the spoon down, her gaze catching his across the flickering candle. "Are you all right?" The words were simple, almost ordinary, yet no one had asked him that with such raw sincerity in a decade. Not business partners, not advisors, not even the well-meaning friends who had drifted away after the funeral. Only this girl. sitting in her threadbare coat with a child in her lap, seemed to see beyond the billionaire mask. "I don't know," Jon admitted, his voice graveled low, surprising even himself. He had spoken more honestly to her in a single breath than to anyone else in years. For a long stretch of silence, they watched each other. The air grew thick, and the quiet hum of wealth and power around them seemed to fade. Clara shifted in her seat, pulling the blanket tighter around her baby. And when the candle's light brushed her face, Jon caught sight of a shadow. There's something deeper, that exhaustion, something that looked dangerously close to despair. He leaned forward, slightly, lowering his voice. "How long has it been?" Her brows knit. "How long has what been? Since you ate a real meal?" Clara hesitated. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then, finally, she whispered, 2 days. The words cut him sharper than any blade. Jon sat back, staring at her with disbelief. 2 days without food. Yet she had walked into the city's most exclusive restaurant not for herself, but for her child. He could feel the questions clawing at him. Where had she been sleeping? Who had abandoned her? Why was she carrying this weight alone? Suspense wound tight around his chest, and he realized this was no chance encounter. This girl was a story he was not yet ready to hear, but could not turn away from. The waiter returned, hesitant, hovering with the check. Jon waved him away. With a glance, his eyes never leaving Clara. "Stay," he said firmly. "Both of you, eat properly." Clara shook her head, gripping the baby closer. "I shouldn't. I've already taken too much." "Taken?" Jon's tone sharpened, the old steel of his boardroom voice breaking through. "You asked for scraps, and I gave you a plate. That isn't taking and surviving." Her lips parted, then closed again. She looked down, tears shimmering though she refused to let them fall. The strength in her silence only deepened the ache inside him. He gestured again. "Eat, Clara. Please." The please startled them both. Jon Maxwell did not say please, not to investors, not to presidents, not to anyone. Yet here it was, raw and unguarded, hanging in the air between them. Clara finally nodded. She began to eat slowly, carefully, feeding herself only after her child had fallen asleep against her chest. Each bite was taken with a kind of reverence that made Jon's throat tighten. And then, in that fragile stillness, the baby stirred. A soft cough broke the air at first light, then sharper, heavier. Clara panicked, lifting the child upright, patting its back, her own face crumpling with fear. The baby's chest heaved, coughing again, tiny body shuddering against her. Jon's pulse spiked. He had not held a child since Caleb. His hands trembled as he reached across the table. "Here, let me." Clara hesitated, terror warring with trust, but the urgency of her baby's cries forced her decision. She placed the child carefully into Jon's arms. The moment his hands cradled that fragile weight, Jon felt something break open inside him. The baby's warmth pressed against his chest, its fragile breaths brushing his collar. And in that instant he was back in another time, holding Caleb as he drifted to sleep. His eyes burned, his jaw clenched. He rocked the child gently, awkward at first. Then, with a rhythm that came from memory buried deep, the cough subsided. The baby whimpered once, then sighed and curled against him, drifting into uneasy sleep. Jon sat frozen, the restaurant forgotten. All he could feel was the fragile heartbeat pressed against him, and the sound of his own chest cracking open after years of silence. And as Clara watched, eyes wide with shock and something softer, something close to relief, Jon Maxwell realized the truth that terrified him most. This was only the beginning. The rain had thickened into a steady curtain when Jon Maxwell stepped out of Le Pavin that night, his umbrella forgotten, his polished shoes soaking instantly on the slick cobblestones. He had not planned to follow her, but when Clara rose from the table, bundled her sleeping child, and whispered a quiet thank you, something inside him refused to let the moment dissolve back into silence. She slipped into the night with the same fragile grace she had carried into the restaurant, her threadbare coat too thin for the wind, her sneakers splashing through puddles, and Jon, billionaire, widower, man of reason, followed without hesitation. The city had its own voice outside the glass walls of Le Pavin. Horns blared in the distance. Neon lights bled into rain-slicked streets, and alleyways breathed with shadows that seemed to shift on their own. Clara walked quickly, clutching the baby close. Weaving through the crowds that bent their heads against the storm, Jon trailed her at first, uncertain, but when she turned down a narrow side street, darker and quieter, his chest tightened. Something felt wrong. He lengthened his stride. By the time he reached the alley. His worst fears stirred into shape. A group of men stood there, their shapes blurred by the rain, but their voices carried sharp and mocking. "Well, look who it is," one sneered. "The little girl who thinks she can hide forever." Clara froze, pressing her back against the brick wall, the baby stirring at the rising tension. Jon could see her arms tightening around the child like a shield, her shoulders hunched in defiance, but her eyes wide with fear. "You still owe us," another said, stepping closer. His coat was ragged, but his stance carried the weight of a predator. "Food in your mouth doesn't pay the debt." Jon's blood ran cold. Debt? They were after her for money. The suspicion that had whispered in his mind at the restaurant grew louder now. Who were these men? What had Clara been forced into? The tallest of them reached forward, his fingers sneaking toward Clara's arm. That was the breaking point. Jon stepped into the alley, his voice iron. "Let her go." The men turned, their laughter cutting through the rain like knives. "And who are you?" "Old man in a suit," the leader jeered. "This isn't your business." But Jon did not flinch. He moved closer, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead, his eyes hard. For years he had lived in silence, wrapped in grief, but at that moment, something ancient stirred in, instinct to protect, the echo of a father who had once lifted his son high above the world. "It is now," Jon said, each word carved in stone. The men exchanged glances. One spat on the ground, another cracked his knuckles, grinning. "You think your fancy watch scares us?" Jon didn't raise his fists, didn't step back. He simply locked his gaze on the man closest to Clara. "Touch her, and you won't live to regret it." The words landed heavy, not loud but steady, carrying the weight of a man who had lost everything and had nothing left to fear. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in their eyes. The tension thickened. Clara's breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to hush her child, her body trembling. The baby whimpered, and the sound cracked something deeper in Jon's chest. Without thought, he stepped in front of her, placing his body between her and the men. The leader narrowed his eyes, then cursed under his breath. "Not worth it tonight. Let's go." They scattered into the rain, their laughter fading down the alley, leaving only the sound of water dripping from fire escapes above. Clara sagged against the wall, her face pale. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered. "They don't forget. They'll come back." Jon turned to her, his chest heaving, rain sliding down his jaw like tears he couldn't shed. "Then let them come for me," he said. "Not for you." Her eyes widened. For a moment, all the defenses she had built seemed to falter, as she looked at him not as a stranger, but as something she hadn't allowed herself. In a long time hope, the baby whimpered again, and Jon reached out, brushing his hand gently over the blanket. "You can't go back to wherever you've been staying. It's not safe. Come with me." Clara shook her head, her pride flaring even through her exhaustion. "I don't want your pity." Jon's jaw tightened. "This isn't pity. It's survival. For you, for her." He gestured to the child. His voice softened, breaking. "I've already lost one child. Don't make me walk away and risk losing another." The words slipped out before he could stop them. Raw and unguarded, Clara stared at him, her lips parting in shock, as though she'd glimpsed a wound so deep it could not be faked. And so, in the rain-soaked alley, Clara made her choice. She nodded once, silently. Jon stepped forward, his umbrella forgotten, the city blurring around them, as he led her back into the night, toward a destination she did not yet know. The air between them carried something heavier than fear, something more dangerous than hunger. It carried the weight of destiny tightening its grip. Asterisk, the elevator doors slid open with a muted chime, spilling Clara and her child into a world that didn't feel real. The marble floors gleamed like a frozen lake, untouched and perfect, reflecting chandeliers that shimmered with silent fire. Walls of glass stretched high into the night, offering a view of the city that looked almost unreal. Towers of light piercing the dark sky, rivers of headlights tracing veins through the streets below. Clara paused on the threshold, her worn sneakers dripping onto the spotless floor, her arms tightening around the baby, as though afraid she might shatter something simply by existing here. She had expected wealth, perhaps even arrogance, but not this. The place felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum, beautiful, vast, and unbearably empty. Jon Maxwell stepped in behind her, setting his keys on a table that gleamed with polish yet bore no sign of use. He moved through the penthouse, slowly, as if returning to a place he had abandoned years ago. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the city beyond the glass. Clara whispered, "You live here." Alone? Jon stopped at the edge of the living room. His gaze flicked toward the far side of the apartment where, tucked against the wall, sat a small wooden chair, the kind a child might use. Painted once in bright blue, but now dulled with age. He swallowed hard. Yes, alone. Her eyes followed his. And in that moment she understood something unspoken. This man was surrounded by everything, yet lived with nothing. The baby stirred, letting out a soft whimper. Clara rocked her gently, whispering a lullaby under her breath, the sound fragile against the cavernous silence. Jon stood frozen, listening. It wasn't the song itself, it was the rhythm of it. The way her voice quivered on the notes. It reminded him of Lillian, his late wife, humming to Caleb when storms rattled the windows. He had thought he'd buried those memories, but Clara's voice dragged them into the light. Sharp and merciless, he turned away, pouring himself a glass of water he didn't need, hiding the tremor in his hands. "You can stay here tonight," he said finally. "Both of you. It's safer." Clara bristled, clutching her baby closer. "I told you before I don't want charity." Jon turned, his face tightening. "Do you think this is charity? You nearly had your child torn from your arms tonight. That wasn't an accident, Clara. That was a warning. Whoever those men are, they won't stop." His voice deepened, harsh with a pain he had never given words to. "I couldn't save my family once. I won't stand by and watch someone else lose theirs." The rawness of his tone silenced her. She lowered her gaze, brushing her lips across the baby's forehead, then nodded once. "Just tonight," she whispered. The storm outside pounded harder, sheets of rain striking the glass, echoing through the penthouse like a heartbeat. Jon led her to a guest room, though guest felt the wrong word. The bed was untouched, the sheets crisp, the air heavy with the faint scent of cedar. He lingered in the doorway as Clara laid her baby down, the tiny body curling into the pillow with an ease that shattered him. He remembered tucking Caleb in, remembered smoothing back his hair, remembered the last kiss before the night of the accident. His throat constricted, his chest hollowing with a grief that never left. Clara glanced up at him. Her eyes were tired but steady. "You love them," she said softly, not as a question, but as a truth she could feel in his silence. Jon pressed a hand to the frame of the door, his knuckles whitening, more than anything. And then one moment took it all. Clara's gaze softened. "And yet you're still here." He laughed once, bitter and hollow. "Am I?" She didn't argue. Instead, she sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing the blanket over her child. The room seemed to shrink, the silence bending around the weight of what hadn't been said. Then she whispered something that pierced him more deeply than any accusation could. "Maybe you're here because you're meant to be part of someone else's story now." Jon's heart lurched. He didn't respond, he couldn't. The idea clawed at his mind. Dangerous, impossible. Yet as he turned away, retreating into the empty halls of his penthouse, he felt the thread tightening, pulling him into something he couldn't control. That night, he sat in his study long after the storm had passed, staring at the framed photographs of Lillian and Caleb, their smiles frozen in time for the first time in years. The silence felt different, not hollow, not endless, heavy with possibility, but possibility could be as terrifying as grief. Jon poured another glass of water he wouldn't drink and whispered into the darkness, "What am I doing?" And somewhere down the hall, a baby stirred in her sleep and gave a soft laugh, light, fleeting, but enough to echo through the hollow chambers of his heart like a promise of something more. Asterisk, the sun crept into the city the next morning, painting the skyline in streaks of gold and pale blue. From the glass walls of Jon Maxwell's penthouse, dawn looked like a miracle, but inside, the silence still pressed heavy. Jon had not slept. He had sat in his study all night, the lamp glowing faintly over untouched papers, his mind circling the same questions. Who was Clara? Really? And why had her path crossed his in such a violent, desperate way? When he finally rose, his steps carried him down the corridor almost against his will. The door to the guest room was ajar. He paused, the sight striking him like a memory resurrected. Clara lay curled on the edge of the bed, her baby nestled safely in her arms, both asleep. The morning light brushed across their faces, softening the weariness that had marked them so deeply the night before. For a fleeting second, Jon felt something dangerously close to peace, but with it came a sharper ache, fear, because peace could be lost again. torn away as it once had been. He retreated quietly, forcing himself back into the routines that had kept him alive for a decade. Phone calls, emails, decisions made with a detached precision. Yet even as he moved through the motions of empire, his thoughts circled back to Clara. The questions would not let him go. By midday, he made a call, discreetly. He told his head of security, "I need everything you can find on a young woman named Clara, 19, maybe 20, blonde. She has a child, less than a year old, and she's in trouble. Look for debt collectors, anyone who might be hunting her." There was a pause on the line. Then the voice on the other end replied, "Understood, sir." When Jon ended the call, his chest felt tight with guilt. Clara had trusted him enough to step into his world for one night, and here he was prying into hers. But suspicion gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the image of those men in the alley, the venom in their voices. If Clara was in deeper danger than she admitted, he needed to know before it swallowed her and the child whole. That evening, Clara emerged from the guest room, her hair brushed back, her clothes still worn but tittied, the baby balanced on her hip. She looked more alive than she had the night before, though the shadows under her eyes remained. She caught him watching and stiffened. "We'll be gone by morning," she said quickly. As if bracing for rejection, Jon shook his head. "You're safe here, for as long as you need." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Safe? You don't know what follows me. Then tell me," he said. His voice was steady, but inside his heart pounded. Clara hesitated, her eyes darting toward her child, as though afraid the truth might harm her. Spoken aloud, "There are people who don't let go once they sink their teeth into you. I borrowed money when I was pregnant. No job would take me, no landlord would keep me. I thought I could pay it back. I was wrong." She lifted her chin, defiant despite the tremor in her hands. "But I will not run forever." Jon felt a swell of admiration and dread in equal measure. He could see the steel in her, the same fire he had glimpsed when she asked for his leftovers without bowing her head. Yet beneath it lay danger that could easily consume her. As the night deepened, Jon found himself in the living room, the baby asleep in his arms once again. Clara sat across from him, watching with a strange mix of gratitude and suspicion. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You don't even know me." Jon looked down at the child. Her small fingers curled around the edge of his sleeve. "Because once I knew what it meant to hold this, and then lose it. I don't want anyone else to feel that kind of emptiness if I can stop it." The words hung heavy between them, raw and unguarded. Clara said nothing, but the shine in her eyes betrayed more than her silence. Later that night, the call from his head of security came in. Jon stood in the dim light of his study, listening. Each word twisted the suspense tighter. Her name is Clara Hayes. Born in the city, no father listed on record. Mother died when she was 12. Since then, foster homes, shelters, part-time jobs. At 18, she gave birth. No marriage, no support system. She's been scraping by since. The men you saw, local enforcers, they've been after her for months. Jon's grip tightened on the phone. And the child, a pause, healthy, but there's something else you should know. Clara's mother once worked for Maxwell Industries, administrative staff, years ago. Before your wife's accident. Jon's breath caught, his pulse thundering. What was her name? Evelyn Hayes. The name hit him like a blow. He remembered Evelyn faintly kind eyes, always polite. One of the many faces in the vast machine of his empire, but the memory that rose strongest wasn't his own. It was of Lillian, his wife, mentioning Evelyn one evening over dinner. "She's struggling, Jon. She has a daughter, bright little thing. I've been helping where I can quietly." Jon's knees nearly gave beneath him. His wife had known Clara, had cared for her once, long before fate had brought her starving into Lipovin. The phone slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the desk. His heart hammered as the pieces began to lock into place. This was no accident. This girl, this child, he was not just helping a stranger. He was stepping into a story his wife had begun before death tore her away, and in the flicker of realization, Jon understood the miracle wasn't that Clara had appeared at his table. The miracle was that she had been sent by echoes of the past, by threads Lillian had spun years ago, by fate itself to lead him back into life. But miracles carried danger, and Jon knew with chilling certainty that if he didn't act, the men chasing Clara would destroy the fragile redemption she had brought into his world. The storm had passed, but the city's nights still felt restless. From the windows of Jon Maxwell's penthouse, the streets glowed like a circuit board alive, unpredictable, humming with secrets. Inside, however, another storm was building. Jon stood in his study, his hand pressed flat against the cold glass, his reflection staring back at him with hollow eyes. Evelyn Hayes, the name would not leave him. Clara's mother, Lillian, had helped her once, quietly, without telling him the extent of it, and now her daughter, years later, had appeared in his life with a child of her own, desperate and hunted. It was too perfect to be chance, too heavy with meaning to dismiss. Behind him, Clara lingered in the doorway, clutching her baby close. She had overheard fragments of the phone call, enough to sense the truth that had been unearthed. Her voice trembled when she spoke. "You knew my mother." Jon turned slowly, in the low lamplight. Clara's face looked so young, so fragile, and yet her eyes carried the weight of battles most never lived through. He nodded. "Not well, but my wife, she cared for her. She cared for you." Clara's lips parted, confusion warring with disbelief. "Your wife, Lillian," Jon said softly. His throat tightened around the name, but this time it didn't break him, it steadied him. "She told me once about a woman who was struggling, raising a little girl. She helped when she could. Groceries, school supplies, sometimes money slipped into an envelope. That little girl was you, Clara. My wife knew you before fate brought you to me." Clara staggered back a step, clutching her child tighter. Her breath came uneven, her heart racing so loud she could hear it. The miracle she had prayed for, it wasn't random. It was tethered to a woman she had never met. A kindness reaching across years and tragedy to touch her life again. But before either of them could speak further, the intercom buzzed. Jon stiffened. No one came to his door unannounced. He crossed the room, hit the button, and a voice slithered through, harsh and mocking. "You've got something that belongs to us. Maxwell, the girl, the baby. Hand them over, and maybe we'll forget what happened in the alley." Clara froze, her face draining of color. Jon's jaw clenched. His voice was ice. "You'll never touch them again." A chuckle oozed through the speaker. "Brave words. But we know who you are. We know what you lost. How much more can you stand to lose?" The line went dead. Clara trembled. "They'll kill us." Jon turned, his expression carved in stone. For 10 years he had lived as a ghost, shackled by grief, existing but not alive. But tonight, the fire that had been smothered roared back to life. He stepped toward Clara, his voice low but steady. "They made a mistake. They think I'm a man who has something left to fear. They're wrong." He called his security team, his voice slicing with authority. Within minutes, the penthouse, filled with men he trusted, their presence solid, their weapons hidden but ready. Jon stood at the center, no longer the hollow widower, but the titan he had once been, only now with purpose sharper than any business deal. When the men came, shadowed figures at the edge of the lobby, knives glinting in the dim light. They didn't find a frightened billionaire. They found Jon waiting, Clara and the baby shielded behind his people. The confrontation was quick, brutal, decisive. Jon didn't raise a fist himself, but his command was unyielding, his presence so absolute, it froze even the most reckless of the intruders. By the end of it, the message was clear. Clara was untouchable now. She was under his protection, and the empire he had built was no longer for wealth alone, it was a fortress. Later, when the danger had passed and the baby slept peacefully once more, Clara sat across from him, her hands shaking. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why are you doing all of this for me, for us?" Jon looked at her, his eyes softer than they had been in years. "Because you weren't meant to carry this alone. Because my wife once reached for you when you were a child. And because when you walked into that restaurant, asking for scraps, you gave me something I thought I'd buried forever." Clara's voice wavered. "What's that?" He leaned forward, his gaze steady. "A reason to live." The words cracked something inside her, and for the first time in years, Clara let the tears fall. She wept silently, shoulders shaking, not just for her struggles, but for the strange, impossible grace that had brought her here. Jon rose, walked to her side, and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "This isn't charity, it isn't pity, it's a continuation of what Lillian began, of what I lost, maybe even of what you prayed for." The baby stirred in her sleep, gave a tiny laugh, the same laugh that had once filled his home. Jon closed his eyes, and in that sound, he felt his heart beat whole again. The miracle had not been the food, nor the protection, nor even the safety of the night. The miracle was that grief and hunger, despair and loss had collided in one impossible moment, and instead of breaking him further, it had given him back the one thing he had believed was gone forever. Hope died and as dawn returned, spilling light into the penthouse once more, Jon Maxwell stood not as a man of wealth or power, but as a man reborn ready to carry Clara, her child, and the legacy of his wife forward into a life worth living.